It's no secret that I am a pretty big Far Cry fan. I've made my fair share of videos on the series. I played almost every game out there and its DLCs, so I knew what I was getting myself into with Far Cry 6. In fact, when you think of the Far Cry series, what do you think of? Is it the Oscar-worthy performances by the villains, the same old Ubisoft formula, or maybe the freedom to carve your path in a chaotic world? But something's changed massively with Far Cry 6, or maybe it hasn't changed enough. That's the real problem with this game. It promised revolution, but felt all too familiar. What even happened? How did a series that I've always enjoyed ended up feeling trapped in a cycle that's beginning to feel outdated? Far Cry 6 had everything lined up. I remember before the game actually came out, the marketing showed a stunning tropical setting, a promising performance by Giancarlo Esposito as the main villain, and the chaos I've come to love. Think about it, your villain is literally Gus from Breaking Bad. He's Moff Gideon from The Mandalorian. He's Stan Edgar from The Boys. So there is no way in hell that Ubisoft can manage to f this up. And f it up they did, because somehow this game felt way too shallow. The AI felt laughably dumb, the storyline felt empty and inconsistent, the cast of characters were just cringe, the enemies were bullet sponges, the terrible overemphasis on gear, and the sheer amount of things to do started to feel like a never-ending checklist instead of a promising game. Far Cry 3 is still, in my opinion, the peak of the series, but that does not mean there are no good Far Cry games after, because I enjoyed Far Cry 4, I enjoyed Primal, I enjoyed 5, but with Far Cry 6, it felt like a Far Cry from the series that I knew. Do you get it? Far Cry? No? Okay. Anyway, what I want to do in this video is revisit the game in 2024 and dive into all the things that did not sit right with me. Now, even though this video will focus on the negatives, that doesn't mean there aren't some good things to mention. Unfortunately, the issues far outweigh the positives. So here we are with a video that I feel needs to be made. Well, not that anyone specifically asked for it, but hey, it's my channel, so I get to cover what I want. Anyway, enough wasting your time. Let's dive into what went wrong with Far Cry 6. Okay, so let's start off with one of the biggest issues, or at least one of the top 2 problems with Far Cry 6, the writing and the tone. The game has all the ingredients for what could have been a truly gripping story. We're talking about a brutal dictatorship, a charismatic villain, and a country ripe with conflict. It's the perfect setup for something deep and meaningful. But instead, the whole experience ends up feeling pretty bland, and that's disappointing, especially considering how Far Cry 3, 4 and 5 managed to deliver stories that gripped me with real emotional moments and complicated character arcs. Let's break down the protagonist, Dani Rojas. I played as the female Dani, so if I say she or her, that's who I'm referring to. Now, Dani has her moments. She's funny and charming at times, but she never evolves beyond the most basic motivation: escape Yara and get to Miami. We do get glimpses of her backstory, like how she grew up as an orphan and her dreams of a better life, but the game barely dives into her inner struggles. It's as if the writers threw in a couple of lines to hint at her depth and then just gave up. There's this constant tease that Dani has more to offer emotionally, but it's never fully explored. Her journey ends up feeling like a series of cliché revolution tropes, complete with one-liners that don't land because the stakes never felt truly high. I remember booting up Far Cry 6 for the first time and being pretty impressed with the opening. It's cinematic, it's brutal, and it sets a serious tone with scenes of oppression, revolution and violence in the streets. You're tossed into this chaotic world and it feels intense, but then you're washed up on a bright beach, and from there the tone shifts to this strange, almost carefree vibe. It's like the game wants to stay in this sunny adventure mode, and that's where things really start to feel a bit off. The pacing of the story does not help either. The main plot is packed with repetitive objectives that just drag everything out. Kind of like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which coincidentally came out just a year before. It feels like Ubisoft is stuck in this formula of bloated missions and fetch quests, and it waters down any emotional impact the story could have had. Instead of giving us a tight character-driven narrative, we get generic objectives that make the plot feel stretched and lifeless. And then there's the game's tone, which is just all over the place. One minute it's a dark and serious story about revolution and oppression, and the next it's just full of silly over-the-top antics. It's hard to take the story seriously when it keeps flipping between these extremes. The game will have you facing some scenes of executions, families torn apart, and the horrors of dictatorship, only to throw in missions where you're teaming up with some f***ing cockfighting rooster named Chicaron, or using a rocket-launching backpack for laughs. The absurdity can be fun, but it makes it almost impossible to connect with the more serious themes. Even Dani herself is a victim of this tonal inconsistency. Sometimes she's reflecting on her trauma, or genuinely distressed over the situation in Yara, and then moments later she's cracking jokes or singing along to the radio during a shootout. It makes the character feel disconnected from everything going on in the story. The supporting characters do not help either. I'll talk more about the characters later, but let's just say Juan Cortez, the eccentric ex-KGB agent. He's someone that's constantly throwing out jokes and ridiculous one-liners, which is entertaining, don't get me wrong, but undercuts the game's attempts at tackling heavier topics. It's hard to feel the weight of the revolution when the game keeps pulling you out of it with comedy. So in the end, Far Cry 6 feels confused about what it wants to be. It has the potential to say something meaningful about the cost of freedom and revolution, but it also wants to be a wild, chaotic playground. Personally, balancing humor and serious themes is not impossible by any means, but you see, Far Cry 6 does not pull this off. Instead, it never commits to either direction, and that left me unsure of what to feel. The whole experience ended up feeling more frustrating than memorable. One of the most disappointing aspects of Far Cry 6 is the lack of meaningful interactions with its main villain, Anton Castillo. If you think back to what made past Far Cry games so memorable, it's hard not to immediately think of the villains. Vas Montenegro from Far Cry 3, Pagan Min from Far Cry 4, and Joseph Seed from Far Cry 5. You see, these villains all had a serious presence that kept you hooked from start to finish, or at least that's how I saw it. These were not villains you didn't just hear about, but actually experienced firsthand. They were charismatic, unpredictable, and always one step ahead, quite literally, making every encounter with them a highlight of the game. Vas was terrifyingly unhinged, and his scenes left you on edge because you never knew what he would do next. Pagan Min was a wild mix of charm and danger, appearing at important moments to remind you just how much control he had over everything. Even Joseph Seed with his cult-like persona, he was around often enough to make you feel his influence. And that's not even me mentioning the other villains like the rest of the Seed family, the Jackal, and hell, even Mickey and Lou. These villains did not just exist in the background, they were integral to the player's journey. Their frequent appearances and interactions made the story feel real, like you were in a constant game of cat and mouse. In Far Cry 6, however, Anton Castillo is mostly a shadow in the distance. He's played by the incredibly and insanely talented Giancarlo Esposito, so there was so much potential to make him the standout villain of the series. In fact, when he was announced, I remember vividly saying he's going to be the greatest villain in any game, period. And that right there was quite literally the dumbest thing I've ever said. So instead of being this ever-present force of nature, he's relegated to a few cutscenes, where he's either giving speeches to his son Diego, or just being generically evil. Sure, those scenes are well acted, I won't deny that. Esposito is talented, and you can tell by these performances. But there is just not enough of them. Castillo never feels like a real threat you're facing head on. You don't get that sense of dread or fear that comes from actually engaging with him. The problem is, the game tells you a lot about how dangerous he is, but it really shows it in ways that directly affect you as the player. You're told he's a brutal dictator, and the game gives you examples of his cruelty, but you're always hearing about these things secondhand, or seeing them from a distance. There are no moments where he confronts you personally or turns the tables on you, which could have made for some seriously memorable encounters. A great example I can give is from Far Cry 3. Remember that scene when Vas hopped out the back of the truck or the van? That was a moment that you never forget because it was so random and out of nowhere. In Far Cry 6, you're left feeling detached from the core conflict, like you're just checking boxes until the inevitable final showdown. It's not that Castillo is a bad villain conceptually, it's just that the game doesn't do enough to use him. The revolution that you're fighting for would feel way more intense and personal if Castillo was constantly getting in your way, taunting you, or even trying to manipulate you. Maybe something similar to Far Cry 4 where Pagan Min would call your radio and attempt to scare you. Imagine if Anton Castillo made surprise appearances to disrupt your plans, or if there were scenes where you go face to face with him, negotiating or being tormented. Those are the kind of interactions that made previous villains stick with you long after you finish the game. And it's a shame because when you have somebody like Giancarlo Esposito as your villain, you want to see that potential fully realized, not just teased in a few well acted but sparse cutscenes. One thing that stands out in Far Cry 6, and not always in a good way, is the cast of goofy side characters. This game is full of wild, over-the-top personalities, which depending on your taste can either be a fun distraction or a huge tonal mismatch. Let's break down a few of these characters. You've got Juan Cortez, a former KGB spy master who's all about revolution and drinking rum. He's the guy who hooks you up with crazy gadgets, like rocket launching backpacks and DIY weapons that look like they were built in a garage. Juan is basically the comic relief of the game, constantly cracking jokes and making snarky comments. He's entertaining, sure, but when you put him in a story about dictatorship and oppression, he feels almost too ridiculous. He's like a character ripped from a buddy cop movie that somehow landed in a game that's supposed to have serious moments. Then there's Chicaron, the psychotic heavy metal loving named Rooster. Yes, you heard that right. This Rooster is a side character who has missions dedicated to him, where you help him wreak havoc on soldiers and destroy military property. It's one of those only in Far Cry moments that's absurdly fun, but it also makes you question what the f is the game trying to be. One minute you're dealing with the themes of political revolution, and the next you're running around with an angry bird who's basically a feathery mini Rambo. It's hilarious, but it also completely undercuts any attempt the game makes at being serious. And let's not forget your amigos, like Chorizo, the most adorable two-legged sausage dog who uses his cuteness to distract enemies. He's a fan favorite for obvious reasons, because who doesn't love a cute little dog with wheels for back legs? But again, when you're supposed to be leading a guerrilla revolution, having a pet whose main tactic is melting the hearts of enemy soldiers feels off. You also meet characters like Philly Barzaga, an explosive expert who's all about making things blow up in the craziest ways possible. Philly is a classic wildcard, constantly spouting ridiculous one-liners and showing off his latest, often ridiculous inventions. He's there to inject chaos and humor into your missions, and while he's entertaining, he's also emblematic of Far Cry 6's tonal identity crisis. When you're trying to liberate an oppressed nation, having a dude who treats everything like one of those American frat party pranks makes it hard to feel the weight of what you're doing. Another side character is Paz, or Paz Bicho Duarte, who's this young, overly enthusiastic DJ who's part of the Maximas Matanzas group, and he's both incredibly fun and a complete liability. His passion for liberating Yara through his music and radio broadcasts is infectious, but his sense of risk pretty much non-existent. One mission that perfectly captures his character involves getting absolutely wasted with him, crashing a party, and then trying to save him from an angry cow. It's ridiculous, over the top and hilarious. He brings so much energy to the game, and while he's a lovable character who makes you smile, his antics also highlight one of Far Cry 6's biggest problems, the inconsistency in tone. When you're supposed to be fighting against a brutal dictatorship, getting drunk and dealing with party shenanigans makes the stakes feel a lot less serious. On the flip side, there's Clara Garcia, the leader of Libertad. She's a red shining light in Far Cry 6, because her tone perfectly matches what the game should have been. She's passionate and grounded in a way that gives the story some emotional weight. Clara used to be a journalist before becoming a freedom fighter, and you can tell she cares about the people of Yara. Her conversations with Danny feel genuine and insightful, making her one of the most human and relatable characters in the game. Whenever Clara is on the screen, the story feels more serious and impactful, and you get a good glimpse of what the game could have been if it had fully committed to this more grounded approach. So yeah, the problem is that these side characters clash hard with the game's darker themes. When the story wants you to care about the suffering of Yara's people or the brutality of Anton Castillo's regime, it's difficult to stay invested when half the characters are treating the whole thing like a circus act. It's fun in the moment, don't get me wrong, but it leaves you feeling like Far Cry 6 does not know whether it wants to be taken seriously or just be a giant over-the-top playground. I've talked about a lot of Far Cry 6 issues, but one of the most frustrating aspects is this overemphasis on gear. The developers tried to inject RPG mechanics into the game by making your character's effectiveness heavily dependent on what you wear. On the surface, this idea might seem exciting, mix and match your gear to suit your playstyle, but you see in practice, it comes off as more of a chore than an improvement to gameplay. Here's a problem for me. The game throws countless pieces of gear at you, each offering specific boosts like fire resistance, poison immunity, or faster crouch movement. It sounds helpful, right? Well, the problem is that most of these benefits are either way too situational or flat out unnecessary. I mean, think about it. How often do you find yourself desperately needing poison protection? Barely ever. And when do enemies use fire or poison? You can usually shrug it off with little impact. The end result is a ton of gear that just sits there taking up space, while only a handful of options feel genuinely useful. Take the Scrounger jeans for example. These pants automatically repair any vehicle you're in, which is cool, but it makes you wonder why you'd wear anything else. The game's gear system ends up feeling more like filler, a checklist of items to collect rather than meaningful choices to make. And yeah, collecting stuff can be fun, but when most of it is practically useless, it cheapens the experience. Remember the old Far Cry games like Far Cry 3 and Far Cry 4? Back then, the gameplay was simple but effective. You had a straightforward skill tree, and your character's progression felt natural. The focus was on the action, the exploration, and the chaos. Now with Far Cry 6, you're constantly pausing the action to fiddle around in the menus, swapping out gear to get through different encounters. It interrupts the flow of the game and makes you wonder if Ubisoft is trying too hard to force RPG mechanics into a series that never needed them. What makes things even more irritating is how easy it is to forget to change your gear. You'll be in the middle of a gunfight, only to realize you're still wearing stealth-focused gear from your last mission, and it's not providing any protection. Or worse, you might have to pull up the main menu mid-fight to swap out outfits, which completely breaks immersion. It's tedious, unfun, and feels like a missed opportunity for smoother game design. In contrast, Far Cry 6 does have some redeeming gear-related underrated moments, especially when it comes to the aesthetics and customization. Running around Yara in a snazzy gorilla outfit looks cool, but if the system requires constant micromanagement and it doesn't add much to gameplay, it just feels like wasted effort. The developers clearly wanted to innovate and add depth, but it ended up backfiring. I remember seeing reviews for this game, and one criticism I kept seeing was that they missed the simplicity of previous entries, and that the game's attempt to be more of an RPG just doesn't work. It makes you wonder, does every game really need RPG mechanics, or can we just enjoy the simplicity of blowing things up in a tropical paradise without having to think about whether our shoes boost our reload speed? Now let's talk about one thing that is quite evidently in your face, and it is a big problem. Bullet sponge enemies. You know the ones I'm talking about. Those seemingly invincible foes who can eat up half a magazine before finally going down. It's an aspect where it's not a minor annoyance. It fundamentally undermines the fast-paced, action-packed gameplay that the series is known for. In the older games like Far Cry 2, 3 and 4, combat felt snappy and rewarding. A well-placed headshot or a burst of bullets was often enough to take down even tougher enemies. It made encounters feel grounded and tactical. But in Far Cry 6, many of the enemies, especially the ones decked out in heavy armor, soak up bullets like it's nothing, even if you're using the so-called right ammo type. These enemies require an absurd amount of shots to put down, which makes gunfights feel like a grind. The issue becomes even more aggravating when you consider the game's emphasis on specific ammo types. If you're not carrying armor-piercing rounds, or if you simply prefer using a weapon that doesn't have them, you're in for a rough time. Enemies with helmets or body armor shrug off regular bullets, forcing you to swap weapons or waste valuable time and resources. It's a mechanic that feels more punishing than rewarding, making combat encounters drag on longer than necessary. The problem is worse during missions with multiple waves of enemies, or when you face mini-boss type characters. These bullet sponge enemies don't add difficulty in a meaningful way. Instead, they add frustration. The challenge doesn't come from clever enemy tactics or engaging AI, but from the sheer amount of damage enemies can absorb. This kind of artificial difficulty can make firefights feel repetitive, and takes away from the satisfaction of pulling a clean, efficient takedown. And let's not forget about the impact this has had on the game's pacing. Far Cry is supposed to be about chaos and improvisation, but when you're unloading clip after clip into an enemy, it slows everything down and pulls you out of the experience. Now, surprisingly, I want to very quickly talk about something I liked, because I don't want to just include every negative aspect of this game, and that is the Stranger Things crossover DLC. This right here is a standout piece of content in this game. It's not just some throwaway crossover, it's a genuinely memorable mission that completely flips the usual Far Cry formula on its head. Honestly, I didn't really expect much when I first heard of it, but man, I was blown away. Right from the start, the whole vibe changes. The bright sunny world of Yara suddenly turns dark and creepy, and you get thrown straight into the Upside Down. The atmosphere nails that Stranger Things feel perfectly. In fact, if you're a fan of Stranger Things like myself, then that's probably the reason it's quite good. You've got the floating dust particles, creepy red lighting, and this constant sense of something's watching you. What I love most about it is how the gameplay shifts to survival horror. You see, normally Far Cry is all about going in guns blazing and feel like an unstoppable action hero, but in this DLC, you start off weaponless, with only a few throwing knives and a pistol with barely any ammo. You have to sneak around, avoid enemies, and stay on your toes. It makes you feel vulnerable and amps up the tension, especially when you're being hunted by the Demogorgon. That thing is terrifying, and you can't really kill it, so running and hiding becomes your only options. It's a massive change from the usual Far Cry experience, and honestly, it's super refreshing. Eventually, you do get some cool weapons, like a corrupted flamethrower, but even then, the horror vibe never lets up. The Demogorgon and the creepy upside down creatures keep you on edge, and there are moments where you just have to hold your ground and fend off waves of enemies, which some may say is repetitive, but in this DLC, it's different. Another thing I really appreciated is how the DLC ties into Stranger Things lore, without feeling like a lazy cash grab. There's a new character, Shest or Six, who fits right into the universe, and there are little bits of story and audio recordings scattered around that make the whole thing feel more fleshed out. Even if you haven't seen the show, you can still enjoy the mission, but if you're a fan, you'll catch some nice references that make it even better. So there we have it. This was a video that was focused on Far Cry 6, because I am a big fan of the franchise. Even though I focused on a lot of the negatives, I still have hope that Ubisoft can turn the series around with Far Cry 7. You might be thinking, what a stupid thought to have. But when every game in this franchise except for one is not good, I will not let that one game change my whole perspective on the franchise. Hopefully Ubisoft acknowledged that Far Cry 6 was not positively received by the public, and they change it around. Anyway, if you did enjoy this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and with that said, I'll see you in the next one.